I've been asked to introduce myself and then briefly myself and then the other speakers. I'm John Cottingham. I'm Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Reading, where I worked many years, and since retirement have been at Heathrow College, London, University of London, now sadly closed, and currently Professor of Philosophy of Religion at Roehampton University, also in London. I worked mainly on 17th century philosophy for most of my career, but more recently on the philosophy of religion, including a book called The Spiritual Dimension and one called Philosophy of Religion Towards a More Humane Approach. But now to get to our main panelists, starting from farthest away from me, though only in terms of spatial matters, not philosophically necessarily, is Douglas Hedley, who is Professor of Philosophy of Religion at here at Cambridge, the Cambridge Faculty of Divinity, and he's currently Principal Investigator for a project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council on Cambridge Platonism, and we've heard something about that in some of the papers for this colloquium. And he specializes, as well as in Neoplatonism, in the notion of the imagination, and probably best known for his trilogy on the imagination, which includes the iconic imagination, 2016, and then there's Sacrifice Imagined, Violence, Atonement, and the Sacred, Living Forms of the Imagination, and a book focusing on Coleridge, Aids to Reflection and the Mirror of the Spirit. Then Simon May, in the middle of the trinity of speakers, is visiting professor at King's College London, and his books include Love, A New Understanding of an Ancient Emotion, which has just come out this year, published by Oxford University Press. And this is a follow-up to a book that has influenced many of us called Love, A History, published by Yale University Press in 2011. He's also written on a wide variety of other topics, including Nietzsche's ethics and a collection of his own aphorisms called Thinking Aloud. And then nearest to me is Roger Scruton, University of Buckingham. Sir Roger Scruton is a writer and philosopher who's published over 40 books in philosophy, in aesthetics and politics, and is widely translated. He's a fellow of the British Academy and a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and teaches both in England and America, and is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. So, let us begin. I've been helpfully given a list of possible topics for our speakers, which have the virtue that they implicitly pick out one of the three. So I'll start by giving each of the three speakers a chance to speak, not at length, but in an unrestricted way about the particular topics that interest them. And then there'll be opportunity for the panelists to respond to each other. And then I may raise some questions before opening it to the floor. So I hope that sounds a reasonable pattern. So this is, I think, mainly directed towards Simon. Why is love connected to our need for roots?
So in my own thinking, I surveyed the history of the ways people have understood love, and I came to the conclusion that there were about 6 distinct ways of conceiving love. One was that love was a response to the beauty we see in an object or in a person. Another was that love was a response to the virtues of character that we see, so we love those who have virtues of character of a certain kind that are similar to our own. Another was that love is grounded in sexual desire, in a desire for sexual intimacy with another person, and so on. And I then came to ask myself, almost in a sort of private dialogue with myself, I said, well, when you love a person, or when you love a piece of music, or when you love a landscape, or when you love God, which I've done on and off quite intensely in my life, I asked myself, what is it that actually you're feeling? I mean, what is it that really that this love is grounded in? And I came to the conclusion, and others might agree or they might disagree, that it's essentially the idea that the loved one was grounding me in a world that I supremely valued, and that was a thing about them. So I might see several people who are very beautiful, with whom I might wish to be very intimate, and indeed to spend a great deal of time, but only one of them gave me this feeling of deep love. And I just, through, so to speak, introspection, came to that view. And I then thought, well, I shouldn't be too solipsistic about this. I should go out and see if this account of my own experience is replicated out there in anyone else's. And the first place to go it seemed to me to be, the great mythical stories that are the foundation of our Western consciousness. And going through the Bible, through Homer, and so on, I came to see such well-known myths as Odysseus's return to Ithaca, as Abraham's call to Canaan, even Proust, when Marcel sees the gaggle of girls on the beach, and there's one in whom he says he sees this new life, he sees this new possibility, new possibilities for being. A whole new world opens to him. They're all beautiful, the girls on the beach. They're all charming. In fact, at first he says, I don't know which one I would alight on. But then he sees in Albertine this, and he describes it as a new world that opens. And I could give you many examples from myth and from literature, but I won't take your too much time in doing that, which it seems to me express this idea that in those we love, we find this world that suddenly we realize is the world we want to live in, somehow promised. And this idea of promise sets up this rich intentional structure of love, because it's always a movement into the future, into some future consummation. And of course it's something that depends crucially then on relationship and developing the richness of relationship that will make it possible to bring this about. And it's not just about meeting a great need like that. And I think when we have a sense of that such a promise is offered to us, it unleashes from us the greatest self-giving of which human beings are capable, potentially culminating in self-sacrifice. That's how great the need is. And I've mentioned a few examples, and with this next one I'll stop. To me, the ultimate example of a loved one that grounds us in a world that we supremely value is, and this is the tradition I come from, so perhaps it's the one that most naturally comes to me, is the monotheistic God. So God is after all conceived as the source of our being, and the source of our being to which we yearn to return. I mean, that the yearning to return to God is something expressed in innumerable texts. Mystics, for example, speak of it all the time. Augustine does. Many people do. So God, for me, is the ultimate. You don't even have to believe in God to see the point, that God is the ultimate source and form and promise of home in a world that clearly is to be supremely valued. So that's, in a summary, my connection between love and roots.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. We'll come back to that, I'm sure, in the discussion. The second question that's been suggested is one that I think is particularly directed towards some of Roger's work, which is the question, what role does or should death play in the way we think about love?
Well, this is obviously something which I have thought about. I don't want to advance a metaphysical thesis quite as ambitious as Simon's, but I would say that there is a non-accidental connection between love and death. And maybe it's true to say, as I do say in my book on Tristan and Isolde, that love of the erotic kind is a relation between dying things. As I say, it's only that which dies that can feel this emotion in the way that we understand it. And this has to do with the fact that love of this kind, at least, is a form of cherishing. You want to care for the other. You're alarmed by the other's vulnerability, and attitudes of protectiveness, possessiveness, of closeness and of clinging. These are not an accidental part of the love. They are really what the love consists in. And it's only because the other is mortal and vulnerable that these attitudes make sense. And I think in the extreme forms of erotic passion, the death isn't just a precondition, but it becomes, or threatens to become, the actual object of the passion. That's what Tristan and Isolde is all about. This supreme fixation on the other as the vulnerable recipient of your care gradually becomes wound together with the thought of her death, and of death itself as the consummation. This is the thing towards which everything is tending, the thing which will actually release the object of your care from all the anxiety which has preceded it. Maybe that's a specific romantic conception of love that's involved in that drama. But on the other hand, I don't think you can, in all the other forms of love, simply put the idea of death aside either. It's the vulnerability of your child which principally sparks off in you the extremes of tenderness and the desire to stand between that child and the fate that would otherwise await it. And maybe this creates a theological problem. Can the angels love each other as we do? These immortal beings which don't fear any harm, which undergo no risks. In the Greek theology, the gods have human relations, quasi-human relations to each other. They're supposed to love each other and be resentful towards each other and all the rest. We see it all happening in the Iliad. But actually, it never makes sense. Even Zeus and Hera, the famous married couple, the only bits that you really are convinced by are the quarrels. And the idea that there is a love between these immortals is a kind of fantasy. You feel there's a kind of an insuperable coldness in their relation, which comes from the fact that they can't really harm each other or protect each other from harm. So I would like to say that at some stage we have to recognize that our mortality is built into our conception of love, and love is partly one of our recourses in the face of mortality.
Right, so got a very different and, as you say, perhaps romantically inspired conception to contrast with Simon's more
Robust.
religious and metaphysically grounded one. But before we come on to that, let's go to Douglas Hedley, our third speaker. The question that's been suggested here is, how can love be understood as a form of play?
Well, perhaps if I could start by referring to the German playwright and poet and philosopher Schiller in his letters on aesthetic education, where he enigmatically says that man only plays when properly human, and we're only human properly when we play. Now, behind that utterance is clearly a thought about what the Germans call Bildung, which is a beautiful word that we don't possess in English. I'm afraid education, I think, is much more limited, and the reason being that this word Bildung has a sense of formation, of cultivation, of the shaping of the personality. And Schiller felt very strongly that the appreciation of beauty is a very important part of this cultivation of the human being. And we've had much discussion about the link between the notion of beauty and love. But my main reason for starting off with the conception of play in Schiller is because I think that Heusinger was right in his wonderfully named book Homo Ludens, Man the Player, to claim that the real opposition between here is not between play and seriousness. There are lots of serious forms of play, and you only have to look at children to see how seriously they play, but between play and work in an instrumental sense. I work for a particular end or purpose, because perhaps there's a pointlessness in play that it shares with love at its highest level. So here I'm thinking of the great German mystic Meister Eckhart, where he frequently refers to the true nature of the divine in his Middle High German as Ane Warumbe, as being ohne warum, or without a why. The love of God is, in a sense, pointless. It's non-instrumental. It just is what it is. It emerges out of the divine plenitude. And perhaps love in the human context, if it is properly love, has a reflection, an image of this pointlessness of true love, but a pointlessness which is coming out of plenitude rather than need.
Well, thank you very much. There are so many questions raised by each of those, but maybe I can go back in reverse order before we open it out to the floor. So starting with Douglas, the pointlessness, I suppose the initial, perhaps naive question that occurred to me is, does this rob love of the ethical dimension, the sense that love is closely connected with value and valuing, rather than notions like play, which could be enjoyable, but aren't thought of as necessarily connected with finding oneself in a moral or ethical sense?
Well, obviously, I think we have to be careful about the various meanings of play, and of course there are some meanings here that are not helpful at all in this context. And that's why I started off by mentioning Schiller. But it seems to me that our culture is still very much dominated by utilitarianism and by an essentially economic view of life. And what this very rich tradition of play, which, by the way, is not confined to the West, but in many ways it's even more deeply grounded in the East, in the Hindu tradition in particular. I recently went to the Holi festival in Mathura, which is, Mathura is the holy city of Lord Krishna, and the carnival-like activity on the day of the festival, throwing water and paint and being generally anarchic, is meant to be an image, a reflection of the spontaneous joy in the divine. And I think in our highly utilitarian, goal-orientated, aims and objective, transferable skills culture, the stress on this dimension of life and essential component of love, which is of a non-instrumental, non-utilitarian nature, I think is very significant.
Certainly when one sees some philosophy departments under the cosh of the government-sponsored research assessment exercise, one wonders if spontaneity and joy in work has gone out of the window altogether. So just moving to Roger, I thought it's interesting that you illustrated the point about mortality and its connection with love by referring to the case of angels and what it would be like to them. But actually, of course, as you know, some of our progressive friends, one thinks immediately of California, I don't know why, hope that we will soon be immortal, or at any rate that we will live for a couple of 100 years, for starters, and people investing a lot of money in this and working actively towards it. Would your view predict that this would lead to a diminution of erotic and other forms of passionate love?
Well, certainly. I would have thought that the little bit of imaginative evidence that we have for this from Aldous Huxley and others seems to suggest that these, at least this kind of immortality, which is just a prolongation of our earthly existence, leads to a loveless form of society, because there is no need anymore for each other. There is each person becomes steadily eroded as a person to become a consumable thing, you know, right. Something that we can take pleasure in. And Huxley describes this brilliantly in Brave New World, and I can't understand how people can actually want to do all this once they've read that book. I mean, it's a testimony, of course, to the literary decline of our culture, that they probably haven't read this book. But I mean, if illiteracy was the only thing wrong with California, the world would be a lot better than it is.
Are we allowed to intervene?
Yes, of course, yes, of course.
Because I would just like to say to Roger, I mean, I'm not sure that I would agree that to get rid of immortality would in some sense pull the rug from under love as such. I mean, certainly in a society that's, you know, deeply utilitarian and where it's all about, you know, preserving the body as healthy for as long as possible and so on, I can imagine that in that kind of spirit there would be no room for love. But all the needs, for example, you know, the particular reasons that I've summarized before, why people historically have thought, you know, love is needed, all those would remain. I mean, we would still wish to find beauty, we would still wish to find virtue. In my view, we would still wish to need to be ontologically grounded in the world in which we find ourselves. We would still be erotically attracted to others. So I don't think immortality, and if I can just, that's one point. And another point on death, which I think you're absolutely right, it's absolutely bound up with love, and for perhaps even several other reasons. I mean, one is, the most obvious one, is that anything that we deeply want, and which we do in a great love, the thought of loss immediately comes into our feelings. We cannot help because we live in a world that's contingent and subject to loss, the ultimate loss being death, we cannot help thinking of death as present, not in a depressive sense, but as inevitably present. And secondly, we live in a culture that is, as Whitehead said, a sort of footnote to Plato. And Plato does give us the idea that we just find impossible, I think, to get rid of. And I don't think we want to get rid of it, but many people do, which is the idea that love ultimately aims for the absolute, for the unchanging absolute perfection of beauty and goodness that is beyond the world of space and time, beyond the world of individuals. And that is an absolute world that can only be accessed, even in imagination, via the thought of death, because it's the death of our existence in space and time and individuality. Only that makes possible the attainment of that ultimate object of love. So in that sense, I think in our culture, and all the cultures that are inheritors of Plato, the relation between love and death is absolutely intimate, and it's very hard to escape from. So those are just two other thoughts on love and death.
Well, yes, I'm not entirely persuaded by what you've just said, although it's obviously full of important observations. If one was to look at the history, the individual history of love, where does it all begin? Obviously, there is that moment of vulnerability, the birth of the individual into this world, where you cling to the thing that gives you nurture and support and protection. And that primordial experience of being protected is one that haunts you through your life thereafter. You're always wanting to recover it. And indeed, if I were to be psychoanalytical about your idea of the ground of being, I would say that's what it is. That's ultimately where we're all going.
I did want to say I blame my mother. It would be too obvious.
But yes, but fundamental to that relationship is the sense of the complete vulnerability of the child, and growing up for the child. Growing up is coming to see that the mother that provides everything is just as vulnerable as you, and so you have to give back in some way. And then, of course, in old age, she is. The whole situation is reversed, and I think that.
But that was precisely my first point about loss.
Right. Well, then that's jolly good. We agree. So you can shut up.
No, that was what I was.
No, fine.
I mentioned loss.
Right. Oh, yeah. Okay.
If I may interject here about in relation to play, there's a very interesting book by Robert Bellah called Religion and Human Evolution, and one of the points that Bellah makes is that play links us in very interesting ways to other mammals. And one of the distinctive aspects of play here is that it requires security. You can't play without having a relatively safe environment. So I think that also has, again, a psychological implication here, that those that don't have the security in their very early phases are often very troubled adults. So there's a lot of child psychology literature here about the significance of play for the development of the robust and strong individual, mature adult psyche.
Good, thank you. I mean, since we're moving a bit towards the psychological aspects of these matters, perhaps I can just bring this back to Simon for the question for him about what he said in his presentation. I mean, it seemed to me that you gave a very concise and eloquent presentation of which you do in your books, of course, of the existential yearning of the human soul for completion, which clearly is a powerful aspect of what it is to be human. But one might ask, so how does that actually connect with love, the ordinary, or not ordinary, but with human love between two people? Is it that love between two people is a sort of sublimated form of, or an easy way of trying to get over this more deep religious question of where we're supposed to be, where we're heading in relation to our Maker, our Creator, or how we are to achieve the selves that we're meant to be? Or is there a very close connection between that sort of religious drive and the drive that draws two people together?
I think there is a very close connection. The drive that draws two people together, the drive that causes you to, having encountered 3 or 4 extremely beautiful people, say, or extremely virtuous people, to choose one of them, I think does have something to do with the promise that, that Marcel felt on the beach when he saw that girl. Whether he turned out to be right or wrong is another point. But just that he saw in that girl a world that he wanted to become part of with her. And the idea was, this is the world in which I will make my life. And perhaps if you believe in concepts like authenticity, which is a very modern concept, just really dating since Rousseau, since the 18th century, I will discover in discovering my own world, I will discover my own inner world, my own inner self, who I am, who I'm supposed to be.
But doesn't that your narrative have embedded within it the very Western idea that integral to love, at least of the erotic kind, is the falling in love moment? In Hindu culture, it's not like that. Your parents negotiate the deal, and you might be discovering your lifelong companion for the first time on the morning of your marriage.
Yes.
But if the deal has been properly worked out and everybody's been attentive to their duty, it works. It seems to last longer. Many people think it's precisely this emphasis on the epiphany, the sudden illumination, the sudden moment of rejoicing in another and clinging to it, which makes our marriages so impermanent.
Well,
I don't know.
I agree, but my emphasis is not on love at first sight. I don't even think those words are used at all in either of my books, ever. My emphasis is much. I keep using the word glimpse in the sense that we glimpse, and the word glimpse suggests that it's pretty provisional. It's just a tentative thing. But my real emphasis is much more on a sort of the Aristotelian type of then engaging and living together and trying to live in this shared world together and to develop lives that are bound up and projects that are bound up.
Yeah, it's much more like a labour that you engage in together, which
a work of love, so to speak, or a devotion, a mutual devotion. But whether or not that coming together is arranged or happens by serendipity is secondary in my own account.
Right.
Anyway.
Maybe this might be a good moment to ask if anyone would like to come in on any of the topics raised. Yes, I think you.
This question mainly addressed to Roger concerning the relationship between death and love, mortality and love. We might, not all of us can hope to be like Walkers and Philemon and end our lives at the same time. And I'm interested in how emotional mortality plays out in couples, where maybe because of reasons of differences in age, or because one is living with perhaps a chronic disease or a terminal disease, one can reliably expect that one's partner will outlive them, or the other way around. Does that change the fundamental dynamics of life?
Well, it could do. Obviously, it's part of the deal, whatever the nature of whatever the age of the partners. It's part of the deal that this is an arrangement between mortals, and you're not going to be able to foretell exactly whether they will go through life always together. That is, but I don't know. I mean, I think when you're aware, of course, you have a vision of what life will be like without the other, and what life would be like for the other without you. But that vision is like a sort of a misty landscape beyond the area in which you are conducting your life. It doesn't impact on it in any direct way. And I think that's even so for people who are living, where one of the partners has a really difficult disease or a mortal disease or something. It's put out of mind because it doesn't have a role to play in the love, except insofar as creating some of the circumstances for the love. I think, but all the caring that two people have for each other is predicated upon the fact that they're both vulnerable, and it's perhaps the vulnerability more than the mortality that matters. Yes, I think actually, I want to go back to what Douglas said about plays, if that's okay.
Yes, of course. I think it's now sort of open.
Right. I totally agree with Douglas's view that Schiller is a really important thinker in this area, and he emphasises play in a rather different way from the way in which it would be emphasised by a psychologist. I mean, for him it was a paradigm of an activity performed for its own sake. You know, that this, when you're, he says in, I can't remember, in business and pursuing of one's needs, man is merely in earnest, but with beauty he plays. So that this was his way of saying that play is the way we should understand the entire range of things that are meaningful in themselves, things which contain their meaning within them. Beauty, and that is the idea of beauty for him, and this is true of love as well. So that the modern sentimental emphasis on love as the meaning of everything is actually, although it's a bit nauseating in the way it's become a cliche introduced into every discussion, it is another way of going back to what Schiller was trying to say, that we only find meaning in life if we find those things which have value for their own sake, intrinsically. In other words, when we have moved out of instrumental reasoning into contemplating the world as it is. And love has that element in it. You know, there is no further reason why you love someone except that he or she is the person that he is, and so love becomes a paradigm of this, if you like, the rescue that we can all achieve from the world of instrumental thinking, so as to be able to see the world as an end in itself and ourselves as justified within that. And so I think that's an aspect of love which is really important. And it is, just to continue what I was thinking about, the way in which love becomes this all cuddly cliche, that is an abuse of love. That is putting love back into the instrumental picture. You know, the consumer society, the consumer version of love, the cuddles available out of from the supermarket shelf. And love, as properly understood, is that thing that Schiller's trying to get at, which is another instance of beauty as such.
And if I may pursue the Scrutonian thought a bit further, That's the reason why the notion of love, not just in our Western tradition, but in other traditions as well, is often closely associated with the sacred.
Yes. Yes. That's another, we haven't touched on that yet, but that's a really good topic. Obviously, going back to the Hindu marriage, what's absolutely vital in the Hindu marriage is not the aspect of choice or anything like that. Is that this is a sacrament. That's what makes it the infinitely valuable thing that it is. Not the fact that a glance across a crowded room has met its match or anything like that. It is this performance in which the whole community is involved, and that's the making sacred, as you would, obviously that's your topic, the making sacred of something by our own sacrificial behaviour.
Which in turn connects, I suppose, with Simon's idea of the being called in a certain direction,
Yes.
the self we are meant to be. And there may be a tension there between the spontaneity of play and the spontaneity of some kinds of love, where people are finding the way for themselves in a free and unconstrained way, between that and the idea of the vocation, the right direction which you might try and get out of, but ultimately you're called to go that way, and only there, in that pre-laid down goal, will you find completion.
Yes. Well, that's great. We were talking about it earlier today, the notion of the call, the Heideggerian notion of the call, which is also there in Live in Us and so on, the summons to be yourself. And I think that connects also with the whole falling in love tradition, that you're being called to be what you truly are by the other. And the problem is we're all agreeing with each other. This is
Yes, we need
I'm just trying to.
we need an acerbic note to be injected from the floor. But whether acerbic or not, would anyone like to?
I was just going to ask
Yeah.
all of you, how do we become educated in love? How do we learn to love?
We clearly learn as children in the first instance, don't we, by receiving love we didn't ask for, and we learn about it before we fully understand it. And as we were discussing this morning, Descartes, who's often thought of, René Descartes, who's often thought of as the champion of the perfectly transparent mind with its clear and distinct ideas, actually said about the passions, and he included the passion of love, that they're often very hard for us to understand because they're joined, without us knowing it, to both to physiological responses which have been laid down way back, and psychologically with experiences of early childhood, for example, of being parented, which are now only dimly, if at all, remembered. And there is a problematic aspect to love because of that, which of course Freud and others picked up on.
Yes. I mean, learning to love is an interesting idea. In erotic love, there has to be that large element of instinct, the immediacy of just wanting that other person in physical way and the way of tenderness and so on. But that's not enough, and everybody then has to learn how to love properly. Say in a marriage, as the erotic fires die down, there is the day-to-day loving, which is the really hard part of it. And I think, that's true also with other kinds of love. Obviously, Kierkegaard's writings about the works of love concern agape, not eros. And his view is essentially that you only love properly the other if God is the middle term. And that means there's a constant labour to bring God into the relation, a constant looking up towards the ways in which your relation with the other will embody an ideal of love. And that is work.
Yes. Can I just add to what Roger said? I think learning to love is less about, although it can be about, I don't want to knock it, the 10 steps to a good relationship, which all the things you hear about, listening and so on, which is very important. But the one thing that seems to me is the real object of education in love or of learning is attentiveness. And attentiveness is, I mean, some people think, I think I'm right in saying Seymour Vale thought that love just is attentiveness. So, I mean, when you are attentive to something, you love it. I don't take that view. I think that love is motivated by other things, but that attentiveness is the absolute key to love going beyond an attitude to a relationship. And I do think attentiveness can be learnt, it can be trained, it's a virtue, and it's perhaps one of the hardest of all the virtues to train. And it's needed to do anything properly in life, not just to love. And the second point I'd make in connection with that is, the mysterious thing, the commandment in the Bible to love God and to love your neighbour as yourself. The old sort of question that was raised in that context, how on earth can love be commanded? I mean, it has to be in some sense voluntary, and if it's not, then it's not the real thing. And my own answer to that, it's just a provisional answer, I don't even know if it's the right thing, is to say, actually, no, love can't be commanded. But what can be commanded is attentiveness. And that you can be commanded, and that's the thing that being naturally lazy creatures, we're likely to, we're very happy to either be told to, in the arranged marriage situation, to be told, this is your wife or husband, or to fall in love across the crowded room. But the hard work of attentiveness is something that laziness naturally sets aside, and I think that can both be commanded and educated.
Yes,
and must be.
Very much agree with that. And just to add a footnote to what Simon's been saying, it seems to me attentiveness is connected with, I don't know quite what the right word is, recognition. That's to say, recognizing the person you love as they are.
Looking, as Iris Murdoch
Looking, yes,
say.
not for what...
Really looking.
Yes, taking the time, and this is immensely difficult, rather than projecting onto them what you think they ought to be, or projecting your needs onto them, but seeing them as a different individual who is different from you, and that difference is essential to, it seems to me, to the proper functioning of love. Douglas.
If you can forgive me for going off on a tangent as well, it seems to me there's also something particularly interesting in the phenomenon of intellectual love, i.e. that curiosity that is part of our being, that the desire to know, as Aristotle puts it, the amor de intellectualis of Spinoza, or the nous eron of Plotinus. I mean, and in a way, it seems to me that part of the crisis of the modern university is the loss of this sense of the love that is part of our curiousness
100%.
about the world.
I totally agree with you. And the loss of play in thought.
Exactly, yes.
It's all become, producing these papers and publishing. I mean, any decent writing, I always feel, is you are playing. You have to enjoy it.
Yes.
And it's a form of play. And I totally agree with you. Totally agree.
Simon, you also make some suggestive remarks about paideia, and I wondered if I could just pick you up on those in your book. And that's partly what I had in mind when I asked about being educated in love. There has to be a kind of almost master-pupil relationship to bring kind of attentiveness that you're talking about.
Yes, I don't think I developed that in great detail,
No,
but I think it's covered by my point about the, learning how to see, learning how to be attentive, but that's not unique to love. That could be learning how to. I mean, the most important thing, for example, when you're playing a musical instrument, assuming that you can basically master it, is to listen to yourself. And unless you don't learn how to listen, it requires unbelievable concentration. I just say that as an amateur. I find that that's far more difficult than getting across the keyboard, is remembering to listen. It just goes, it can go within 2 minutes. You're just playing. And I think in love, I think, well, like in everything, it's really no different to anything else. This is something that ideally you should be taught, yes. I would institute that at a very young age. Teaching people how to listen, teaching people how to attend as part of everything they do. That's really all I meant there, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
I just wondered whether that point connects to Douglas's emphasis here on play. Because if love involves a rescue from the world of instrumental thinking, making sacred of something, learning how to really attend to the value of a person or thing, then I had the impression that your thought was that play has a privileged place in that enterprise, that it's in play that we learn to have this non-instrumental attitude towards persons or things. So in that case, play would have a particularly important role in cultivating the sort of valuing involved in love.
Yes, carefully construed, obviously I'd want to avoid some of the misleading associations of play, so I'm drawing quite consciously on this particular philosophical tradition.
And Plato has a lot to say about play in the halls.
Absolutely, yes. Also, I think it's interesting that it, in a way, play is prior to culture, and yet paradoxically the highest forms of culture are themselves forms of play.
I think there is an interesting contrast here between working together and playing together. Workmates have a task that they share, and people who work together in on a building site for, say, 3 years become very close, but not in the way that people become immediately close when playing a game together.
Or chamber music.
Or chamber music, yes, and so on. This is a form, both of these are forms of togetherness which are not yet love. But you might nevertheless nurture your whole life on this. There are people for whom playing in the team every Saturday, that is their life. And it replaces love in a way, because it is also fills their life with a sense that there is something which is an end in itself, even if it only comes around on a Saturday.
James, I think you.
Yes, I think Henry's first, but since it ties to what's just been discussed, I think I agree with Simon that in the Jewish and Christian conceptions of the divine play doesn't feature a great deal, at least in the sort of canonical texts, but there's quite a strong strain that creation is an act gratuit, as it were. It's wholly unconstrained. It's not hard work for God.
He has to rest on the seventh day.
I suppose so. And that the adequate, the sort of proper response, you see this in the Psalms a lot about the valleys clapping their hands, and sort of the adequate proper response. Creation is similarly sort of unconstrained, playful, rejoicing. And I suppose also there are many forms of play that do have a telos. Games have a quite complex teloi. But anyway, just to...
Yeah.
And there's the notion of Sophia, wisdom, and the rather enigmatic reference in Proverbs to wisdom. It's often translated as playing at the dawn of creation. That gets picked up by the Russians, particularly Solovyov and others.
I thought as you were speaking, James, the valleys shall stand so thick with corn that they shall laugh and sing. Or all the woods in the forest shall sing for joy. But in that line from the Psalms immediately follows, for he comes to judge the earth. So the serious note comes back pretty quick.
Play while you can.
Yes. Well, no, I think they're rejoicing at justice, coming down like the yes. And so the selves we are meant to be in a serious way is never far from the surface.
Right.
Sorry.
So, just maybe to push back against the idea of play as a way of thinking about love. I mean, it's often said, and quite correctly, that a successful romantic relationship involves continual compromise, navigating different difficulties, deferring of temporary pleasures, all sorts of hard work. And that, at least superficially, seems like a tension with the idea of love as involved in play, the idea that it can be an arduous, painful process to being involved in love. So I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to comment on the resolution of this contradiction, if it is purely a superficial one.
Well, I would say that, of course, that there's hard work involved, but it is for an end, and that end is something more akin to play than to work. You've got to work to get into the situation where you can renounce work and just sit and be, as John was saying, just be by the fireside. So I suspect there's no real contradiction here. But obviously everything that is being treated as a means is hard work. And it's when you've got through to the other side that the play aspect. I mean, we might not want to call it play, but we might want to just to say it's the fruition of being, or something like that.
I suspect the turn the conversation is taking may be a hint that we ought to be thinking about drawing our discussion to a close. We've been going for well over an hour, but we have got time for, particularly for anyone who yes.
I was wondering if there was some comments to be made about, and picking up on what you said in response to James's question, about God's labours, and resting whether this idea that the seventh day of creation, the Judeo-Christian account, is precisely a renouncing of work, a laying down of work, and setting aside of work, and that may. We're just interested to know what you make of that in the light of the conversation.
The idea of the Sabbath, of course, is very important. Is sacred time which is set aside from the rest of the week, and God's loving work of creation allows for that sacred space for human beings. Any parent who kept their child at it 7 days a week would not be a loving parent, I think, almost by definition.
Actually, the Sabbath idea, I think, is fundamental to understanding love in the end. It's like yesterday I talked about the smile. Smiling at someone is a way of being with that person, but not in any way using them. Or it's a sort of blessing conferred on the other, saying it is good that you are. And I think that's what people do when they're in a proper loving relation, that they are conferring on each other the blessing of a smile, saying, I am towards you in this way because it's good that you are. And I think the Sabbath is a way of understanding the whole world like that. For a brief moment, you lay aside the instrumental way of thinking and see the world as God sees it, and say it is good. And there's a collective smile. This is one of the great triumphs of the Jewish religion, I think, to have implanted that smile in the heart of ordinary life. And I think if I were to go on moralising, I would say it is one of the worst things that's happened in my lifetime is the abolition of Sunday, the abolition of the day of rest and the day that is set aside not to do things but to appreciate the world. But I think love has a lot to do with that. You know, I was brought up, as we all were, I'm sure, in a world in which Sunday was reserved for the family and for the loving relations in which you were embedded. And Sunday lunch was a very important episode in which you celebrated this. The fact that my father was so appalling that I only wanted to run away is a minor difficulty in my life. But,
on the other hand, there are a number of novels, Victorian novels, can't cite chapter and verse, where Sunday is a pretty grim, because they're not only, I mean, they can't go to work, but they're not allowed to play either. They have to sit and read and improve.
Well, of course, the whole Massachusetts experience, where the Puritans released themselves at last from the old world where they had to play on Sunday. Now they could forbid it.
Could I just ask one question? I think this might be an opportunity for some disagreement, because Simon is very clear that love doesn't necessarily have anything to do with beauty, whereas I think for Roger and Douglas, love and beauty are quite close. And even if on Sunday we're recognizing that it is good, I think that's another way of saying there's something beautiful about it all. All this work has made it right, made it fit. So I wonder if this would be an opportunity for some disagreement on the panel.
I think you're trying to manufacture disagreement where there is probably not that much.
Okay.
I mean, certainly not about Sunday. And as far as love is concerned, yes. I mean, I think that love can be aroused where we do not perceive beauty in an object. But I think that the moment we love somebody, we will then see beauty. We will then impose beauty on them, and that's, But I know that my distinguished panelists disagree with that. They're not going to rise to it.
I think we should
another
not.
Area, isn't it? Entirely.
Yes, another area.
We should not
Exactly.
manufacture discourse. I think.
Except one could say, of course, well, I don't want to take this on too long, but of course, there's the complexity of the notion of beauty,
Yes.
and the complexity of, as Frisbee very eloquently mentioned, in the beauty of Socrates and the paradox of that beauty that nevertheless bids, but it's a notion of beauty that is tied to a certain notion of a training of the soul. So perhaps our disagreements are less pronounced than I thought.
Good. Well, I sense we've reached the calm. We're unable to get out of the calm waters, despite James's valiant attempt to. But it's been a very interesting discussion, and obviously food for further thought. So I'd really like to thank James for organising the panel, and our three panellists, Douglas, Hedley, Simon May and Roger Scruton, for a most fruitful discussion. And above all, thank you all in the audience for coming and for your questions and for keeping us at it. Thank you.
Thank you.